at what age? Like, how is it decided for you? Are they arranged marriages? Can you date within the community? How did you then become, wife and partner to your then husband?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I get asked that question a lot. Is it arranged? It's a difficult one to answer because it's not totally arranged, but there's no mixing of sexes. So even like up till today, they even have the lockers separate in the schools for the boys and girls. They don't do PE together. They're separated as much as possible. Um, and I mean, as a young person, I used to get into trouble for standing in a group of girls. There was a few rebellious ones standing talking to a group of boys, and that was frowned upon. But if you were ever to be on a one-to-one on a regular basis with a boy, as in just talking to them, that meant that, yeah, there's something going on here. Um, and in 1986, I went to my first, what we call 3-day meeting. So it was like a 3-day conference in Coventry. And I was really trying hard to toe the line at this point because I knew you had no other way to go, really. Um, and so I thought because of that God might show me my husband. Anyway, so as much as flirting goes, if you like somebody, it sounds absolutely bizarre now, but you would sit where you could see that person that you maybe liked across the meeting, and you would maybe smile, and you counted how many smiles you got from him, and he probably did the same, as to wonder, does he actually like me? So when I went to these meetings in Coventry, I saw this guy, and he was sitting just sort of to the side of me. I had seen him once before, and I caught his eye, and we had a bit of that smiling back and forth. And then I spoke to him with another young girl and boy. We spoke as a sort of foursome, just very, very briefly. And I never spoke to him again. That was on the Saturday, and on the Sunday, we carried on this back and forth. And on the Sunday, he gave a note to somebody else to give to me to meet him round the back of the meeting secretly. So he was just 18 at the time, and I was 17. And anyway, we met, and we had about half an hour maximum before I had to leave to go back home. And anyway, in that conversation, obviously there was no touching, no physical touch whatsoever. We sort of talked a very little bit, and yeah, then he handed me a £10 note, and written across the top of it, it said, "Love you always and forever."
Oh my word! And that was it. That was how your fate was decided, from a
Yeah,
few glances and.
yeah. But then we weren't allowed any contact whatsoever because he had to be able to afford to buy a house. And it took him 5 months to buy a house. So we had
So
no
this was kind
contact.
of. So was that the stipulation? Was
Yeah.
you're both part of the same cult or community, but from different areas? Where were you living at that point in time, age 17?
I was in Northern Ireland, yeah.
You were
And he was
still
in
in Northern
Coventry.
Ireland at that point. And he was where, sorry?
Coventry.
Oh, so he was based in
Yeah,
Coventry.
yeah, yeah.
And so how did, so I'm fascinated by this. I feel like this podcast is going to go on for decades. There's definitely going to be part two, part three. I'm just fascinated by it all because it's so far-fetched from the reality that I know, and I know many other people know, which is, you go out, you go dating, you choose whoever you choose, and if your parents dislike that, then, you might get a little bit of a telling off, but
Yeah.
ultimately your decision is your own, and that's very evident that this wasn't the case with yourself. So does he then, tell people in his community, I really like Anne, I want to marry Anne, and then it's identified that, you can't date, you can't speak to one another? Who stipulates that he
So,
must be
so
able
that
to buy a
that
house?
yeah, that was a rule from the man of God at the time. That was the rule. Um, and then once he had a house, we were allowed to see each other once a month. Um, in Bristol, actually, because they had a massive big hall. So we used to meet in Bristol for like an hour. But again, we weren't allowed any physical contact we had to be in the company of others. Um, but yeah, this was all stipulated from the top. But before you could make the whole thing public, and we didn't get engaged. There was no engagement ring or anything like that. That's why I value this. There was no. He didn't actually ask me to marry him. There was no get no. But anyway, they have to. You have to ask permission from the man of God. Now he can refuse, even if he doesn't know you. But apparently he does know you.
Because he's the man of God.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I cannot get my head around this. So your parents have no say in it because effectively they relinquish all decision making to the
Yeah.
man of God because everyone within the cult adheres to his rulings. And by the sound of things, he can do this on a whim. He can decide
Ah,
what he chooses. He's a
absolutely.
raging alcoholic, so he could be completely, he's
Yeah.
not compass mentis at all. And what he says goes.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Oh
it,
my word.
yeah. So up to current day. Well, I say current day. When my eldest son. So that's going back to 1986. That's what it was like. It really hasn't changed a lot. In 2012, just before I left, um, in September of 2012, my eldest son was 24. He had a house, no sign of a girl, um, which was a bit of a concern for, really should have been getting married. What was, So it was arranged that his uncle from UK would have him over because they had somebody in mind for him. And so he went and stayed with his uncle, and they had this family for dinner, and they looked at each other across the dining room table, and yeah, they quite liked the look of each other. That was as far as it went. They didn't speak to each other. That was, yeah, but that was on the Sunday. On the Monday, he came home, and I'll never forget, he came into our bedroom and he said, "I found my wife."
And that was
Um,
literally just from that one conversation. It wasn't
and
even a
then,
conversation,
yeah,
one meeting, one
no.
glance.
Then they were allowed an hour's phone call once a week, but it still wasn't public, because he was waiting for an answer from the man of God. Then, no, he didn't do that then. In December, I flew over here with him, and yeah, it was on Christmas Day 2012. I was with with her family. He wasn't even allowed to stay in the same house in case they got up to some mischief. Anyway, we all went for a walk, and they were probably about 3 meters in front of us, walking along, not touching, and he asked her to marry him, and she said yes. But they didn't actually get married for quite a while because the man of God, who's the current man of God, he said that he had to earn more money before he could get married. And I'll say this, that was the most unfair judgment because my eldest was the one that saved all his money, got a house, paid a deposit for it, and was really careful with money. And if anybody deserved to get married, he did. But yeah.
This just, it beggars belief that this person who is at the top of the hierarchy through whatever means, whether it's voted in, whether, he is the man of God and chosen, whether it is passed down generationally, just gets to decide people's fate, whether that be yours in, at 1986 to the point of getting married and still into the, late 20 teens,
As,
2019,
as far as
etc.
I know, it's still happening. From anything I hear, it's still the same.
But knew no different. Your entire
Yeah.
kind of connections, your friends, your families, you were all part of this same thing. So without a proposal, without a courtship, without, the usual things that people experience in that exciting lead up to getting married, yourself and your then husband get married. You went on to have 5 children.
Yes. Yeah.
Boys and girls, what's the split?
Just one girl, so 3 boys, a girl, and a boy. Yeah.
So 5 children living, would you say you lived a happy life, or was it that you lived as happy as you could within those means, knowing there was always something more?
No, it wasn't happy. when you get married, you have to go and live where he's from. There's no choice in that. So I ended up at 18 moving to Coventry, and as a place, as a city, even in the outside world, I hated it. I had
Mm.
come from a seaside town, and I just hated the city. Um, and then the actual community, the cult in Coventry was really, really strict and really difficult. I was only allowed to see my parents once a year. Um, so either we would go there one year and they would come to us the other, and always we had to ask permission from the local leader, and I was just homesick from I was homesick, and my marriage was very unhappy and not a good marriage, abusive, in every sense of the word, and yeah, it was just I hated it. Um, and I had all five children there. And in '03, then I had a nervous breakdown. And in '04, it was decided it would be better if we moved to nearer my parents. So that's how we ended up going back to Northern Ireland. Um, but yeah, obviously, the having of children, there's no contraception. So as many as, yeah. And that puts huge pressure on a marriage as well.
Absolutely, because it's not just yourself you're then fending for. You've got all of these, children relying upon you. There are so many archaic rules: no TV, no mixing outside, no contraception, and it sounds like. And I can very much judge from the outside. That's all I know. But from the outside, it sounds very much like those who are decision makers pick and choose which of the religious
Absolutely.
rules that they adhere to as well. I was
Yeah.
raised in a Catholic faith. I was raised in a Catholic school. We were taught what was right and what was wrong. But it sounds very much like they picked and chose what suited them at that particular point in time.
Yeah,
And
no,
so,
absolutely.
did you know immediately? Was it quite early on that you knew as soon as you'd moved to Coventry, it was kind of, this is a mistake. I'm from a seaside town. I'm now in a city. You know, especially because of the upbringing that you had, which was a very sheltered upbringing by the sound of things, to then effectively be ripped away from everything that you've known, your family, your own individual support network. Was it pretty evident you'd made a mistake? And, I'm going to assume that divorce or walking away from a relationship was just never going to be
Yeah.
allowed.
I suppose I always, for many, many years anyway, I always put it on myself that there was something wrong with me. Because, the fact that we were in the same community, why could I not just love this person that had been brought up the same way? But I didn't know him. We weren't compatible even on a normal level. We weren't compatible. There was nothing, our humor wasn't the same. There was nothing that we were compatible, aside from all the other stuff. And yeah, for many years I thought there was something wrong with me. Um,
Is that what led to your breakdown? Because this was a complete nervous breakdown that you had. Was it just decades worth of all of the stress, the being upset, the hating the life that you live in, bringing children into this world? Was it just a culmination of things that led to this
yeah,
breakdown?
it was just a huge culmination of being constantly downtrodden, I think, um, exhausted. There was no, you didn't, you had to get up at 4:30 on a Sunday morning to get the kids up for communion, the Lord's Supper. You had to do it. We were, if it didn't do it, he was like, well, what was it? The man of God had said that if you had to crawl there, you would, you had to be really ill not to go. And yeah. And you were just downtrodden, exhausted, unhappy. Yeah. To the point where you just wished that you weren't there anymore. And I suppose that was sort of the point I got to in '03. And my parents came and because I phoned mom, I was pretty, yeah, I was suicidal, and they just immediately came over and got us, me and all the kids, and took us back home to them. Um, didn't give my ex a choice in that decision. Um, yeah, I don't remember a lot of the summer of '03 because I was quite heavily drugged and that sort of thing. But they had no choice then but to send me back. You know, that was, yeah.
So was what your parents I literally can't even get my head around this. How hard it must have been for you, having been effectively torn away from your parents at such a young age, then being forced into this life of, being mum, subservient wife, doing exactly what you're told, and then just day after day it getting worse and worse and worse to the point where, as you say, you wished you were no longer here. Was your parents coming to get you? Was that deemed kind of a punishable offence, if you like, by other people within the community, or was it so evident that that was the only option based on you how you were?
It's certainly the elders in Coventry would have felt it was, they weren't told. You know, it was done very secretly because they would not have agreed with that. Um, but I will say, back home, there was a bit more lenience around that sort of thing, and yeah,
It
if
was
a
a lot
woman was suffering like that, they did tend to, it was all mental health problems, and they were a bit more sympathetic than in some places. Um,
and
but
therefore,
yeah, but they just didn't have dad and mum didn't have a choice. That they were not to come between a marriage, is what the parents were taught. Never come between the marriage of your children. Well, yeah, so often they should have come between,
yeah.
but they couldn't.
They were so stuck in the rules, and having been, generationally brought up in this cult, they've seen their parents, their grandparents fall under these kinds of regimes. And so the point at which it was suggested or agreed by the decision makers, which are still, for struggle to get my head around, the decision makers decided you were able to move back to Northern Ireland to be closer to your own support network, to be closer to your family. Was that yourself and the 5 children, or was that also with your then
No, no,
husband?
no. That was the whole family. Yeah, that was the whole family. But that wasn't an easy process, um,
No,
because
just
we had
moving a problem.
we had to go through what was called a commission. Yeah, so it was called the Moving Commission. so so we had to sit we had to sit for ah hours discussing why we were moving, because if we were only moving for my family and for natural reasons, that wasn't a good enough reason. So we had to prove that we were moving to strengthen the position in a smaller place. So it was like somebody said to me, that sounds a bit like the army or something. We had to make sure it was the Lord's work we were moving for, not not for ourselves.
But this was all, you've got to prove a strategy for the reason for you to move.
Yeah,
You're coming from a stricter position in the
yeah, yeah.
Coventry part of the community. Therefore, you'll bring back those rules, those regimens. Oh my God. And this was in 2004.
Yeah.
And for
We
those
had to
people
go
who
through
don't know,
so many hoops to actually get moved. Yeah.
but for those people, obviously, I know you in a completely different capacity. I know you as the green lady. You're wearing your green today. There's always something there. You are happy. You are bubbly. This sounds like you were a shell of the person we see
Oh,
today.
yeah.
How then? So you moved back to Northern Ireland. Obviously, it was an ordeal for that to happen. Difficult for you as well, because obviously you've raised your children to a certain point in their home in Coventry. They've moved back then. You've moved back to Northern Ireland. Did anything change, or were you just uprooting a problem from one place to another?
I would say I was happier in myself because I was nearer my family. And certainly, like, me and my mom were really close. I used to go to their house every day for breakfast. But as regards the marriage, no, things actually got worse because I always I think he's a victim too of many things, and that's what made him like he was. But he was a victim in this situation, in the sense that he was being uprooted from all he'd ever known, and he was being put into something that he wasn't particularly happy in, and that added to his stress levels, which were then obviously passed on to me and especially physically onto the children. Um, so that only got worse, a lot worse, and came to a head many times, I suppose, where my dad would try and intervene as much as he was allowed to intervene, but they could never do anything. There was nothing they could do. There was their hands were tied.
I can't even
Um,
imagine as a parent how hard that was for your parents to watch you suffering. But in addition, for you, then as a parent, suffering yourself and watching your children suffer in those kind of
yeah,
environments.
yeah.
What were your coping mechanisms? How on earth does someone, because there are people who go through some horrific things in life, and you've been through many more since, but quite often they are situations that there is no way out of. For you, it must have felt there was no way out. The reality is, a different story. How did you cope day to day with that being life?
Not very well, to be honest, and I suppose I did use alcohol to help me. I would make sure I had a glass of whiskey, and I mean a glass of whiskey, that much, um, before he would come home in the evenings, and that, yeah, and that didn't help really, did it? I was under psychiatrists a lot. Um, I was on like the highest dose of antidepressants that you could be on. In 2012, in May of 2012, I don't remember exactly what happened, but I lost my speech for 24 hours. They actually thought I'd had a stroke, but I knew I hadn't had a stroke. Everything was in my head, but it just wouldn't come out. I couldn't speak. And I think, yeah, that was another point of crisis.
Yeah.
In a way, that was the turning point, I suppose, for me. And then I was taken to hospital, and they realised it was my mental health, and they actually put me into what were called self-esteem classes. I didn't tell anybody I was going to those because that wasn't something you would go to. But it was there that my eyes started to be opened, really. But I still didn't know what my way out was or if I ever could get out.
So all of these things happen, and we're just cementing this thought in your head, which you'd had from a really young age, from being, the rebellious teen who wanted to stand and, converse with boys, which was frowned upon, and not even do anything untoward, but converse with boys, which was frowned upon, through to the feeling you're not good enough, cementing those feelings. That was 2004. You moved back to Northern Ireland. Well, fast forward in 8 years. That's 8 years of hurt, upset, anger, feeling worthless, using alcohol as a crutch. But I'm guessing hiding that fact, because again, that would be frowned upon, just to get you through the day. There are people was everything, was all of your, when you're under psychiatrists, when you're being medicated, all of this still within the cult? Was it doctors, psychiatrists, etc., within the community, or was this, the one instance where it was allowed outside?
No, it is allowed outside, but this didn't happen in my case. I did just see normal psychiatrists. But for me, and it was what we were taught, we didn't talk about those things. Our life was a secret. So that wasn't the bit you talked about. You might have talked about money worries, or you might have talked a little bit. I do remember talking to my doctor about how he was treating, not just some of the things of how he was treating me, not everything. But as regards our life and how we lived, you never ever. That was a traitor. You didn't do that. Um, but nowadays, they actually pay psychiatrists to give what they want them to give.
Oh my God. It sounds like it's evolved so much
Yeah, yeah,
during
it's
the
got a lot
time
worse.
frame since you left, and yeah, evolved for the worst. So we fast forward then to 2012, summer of 2012. You've got all of these mental health challenges that you're facing. You're self medicated, you're being medicated, you're effectively trapped in your own body, which is your body's way of kind of shutting down, if you like. You go and see doctors. At what point did the decision come? Because you say, you've had your eyes opened, you're now mixing on a more regular basis in these self-esteem classes with outsiders, worldlies. Your eyes were opened
Yeah,
up to, a completely different world. That was in the May of 2012
yeah,
onwards.
yeah.
It wasn't how did it then come about that you made the decision, or at least started the thought process of, actually, this is something that's not right for me and I need to leave?
Yeah, I suppose, and I say this often, and I think this is often the case for people in situations like this. It's a life and death thing. For me, it got so bad in my head, this living a lie, this constant battle. It was, yeah, I either had to finish me or I had to get out. I didn't know, yeah, and I came to that decision while standing at the end of the pier in my hometown, that something did say to me, um, there is another way. I had no idea what that other way was, no idea. I didn't really plan, although, it'd been in the back of my mind, could I, for probably 3 years, but I never really planned it. And I think it's very difficult to plan something so drastic.
Absolutely.
It was just once I came to that decision, I knew I could never go back.
Yeah.
And I knew that, yeah, that somehow, I mean, to start with, I thought I'd have to be kidnapped. I spent a week thinking of who could kidnap me. And I even wrote letters to my kids, almost like suicide letters, but not, because, and then I thought, no, I can't leave them. I can't walk out my front door. And there's nobody knows how it's going to turn out, but I just decided I would just say, this is over. And that's what I said that Sunday night. I just said, this is over. The marriage is over and everything. I'm out. I'm out of this.
That
Uh,
must have been the scariest thing that you'd ever experienced.
oh, it
You know,
was. Um,
but it was self-preservation by the sound of
yeah,
things, of either I'm going to end my life or I've got to end the situation that I'm in.
but there was still that overriding fear. I was constantly up till the last minute bargaining with God. I was saying, okay, if what I'm doing is wrong, show me. And I went to the communion that Sunday morning, and I remember, I remember thinking, if what I'm doing is really wrong, then God will strike somebody down. Somebody's going to die this morning. And I honestly believed that, my mom or my dad or somebody would drop dead, and they didn't. And then it was like, oh, okay, and I can keep going, I can keep going. And yeah, and it was like that actually, even after I left, it was still that in your brain, that brain conditioning, is it, or brainwashing?
Yeah.
It takes a long time to get rid of that fear. But yeah, when I said those words, it was chaos in our house. It was chaos. It was kids screaming. It was, yeah. I mean, my older boys were in their 20s by this time. They weren't kids, little kids, but yeah, the place just fell apart. But I kept my resolve, and I don't think I could have if I hadn't come to that such a low point that I knew. Um, yeah, and I literally, from the next day, I went. Sounds bizarre, but I went out and bought jeans. I went out and bought, I went out and got my hair done. I spent a whole week just literally transforming what I looked like. Um, just maybe to show to them also that I meant this. Um,
So this was in early 2013, is that right?
yeah, January. Yeah.
So January 2013, and there's so many people who'll be sat listening to this who we've all been there, the New Year's resolutions, new year, new me, and here you are literally living that, the hardest decision that I can't even fathom myself having to make. You've got 5 children, the eldest are in their 20s, but your youngest was how old at this point?
He was 11 and Natasha was 13. Yeah.
So you've got an 11-year-old, a 13-year-old. The reality is you must have known at this point that dad, the elders, the community, the man of God are not just going to allow you to take your children and walk away,
Yeah.
but for your own sanity and your own, effectively, ensuring that you still live. What did you do? So you moved away. Where did you go?
I
Because
didn't.
all of these,
I didn't move
you didn't
away.
go.
So I, like I say, I told them, and then it was just amazing because like you just don't know how it's going to work out. And so I was assigned priests who happened to be my brother and my uncle. And when they came to visit me 3 days later, they said, "Would it help if we moved him out of the house?"
Wow.
So I was
So
left in. I was in the family home with my 5 kids. Um, and it was quite quick that the older boys, well, certainly number 2 and 3 left fairly quickly, and I understand it was like a very confusing time for them. It was,
absolutely.
you know, yeah. I mean, my second was he was about to get married. Um, yeah, it was a really difficult time. My third son stayed for 2 weeks, and then yeah, I just came home one day and he was packing to leave. He went and lived with my mom, my dad and mom, and my second son, he went and lived with my brother. And then the eldest stayed, and he was like acting like a father figure, if you like, in the house. And it was quite difficult because he kept me quite separate and kept the 2 youngest quite separate from me. Um, and then he finally left and went and lived with my parents in the September. And it was actually easier once I was left with the 2 youngest. Sorry, you were going to ask something.
Just it must have been so gut wrenching to know that you're effectively, your family isn't going to remain in the same unit that it has been, but no one's happy. You're not happy with the way the children are being raised. To say that you kind of effectively went and broke the rules and you got your hair done and you bought jeans just shows the level of control that there was within your life from others. You then stayed with your 2 younger children. What happened then?
So yeah, I went through the courts and got custody of them. It was shared custody, but I had them most of the time. What I didn't do was I didn't stop them going to the school, the Brethren school, and to the meetings. I felt because they were that 13 and 11, like to uproot them and take them from all they'd ever known. I thought they would turn against me. Whether that was a right thing or not, it's difficult to know. I did what I felt was best at the time.
Yeah.
Um, and we did become like a little family unit, They did, yeah. There was things that I took them to that they would never have been to. I didn't get a television for about a year because I didn't want them to be upset. I got one in my bedroom first, then I got one in the lounge, and yeah, I'll never forget when I got it in the lounge. They were a bit cross on me to start with, and then every evening, first Natasha would come in and sit on the edge of the chair, and yeah, she would come in and sit in the arm of the chair. Then she'd move to the chair, and then the other one would come in, and yeah, gradually they sort of she relaxed. Definitely, she relaxed, and yeah, got to enjoy it. And then, of course, when I got diagnosed with breast cancer just a year after I left, they were my rock. They were. They were.
You think you've been through the hardest thing that you're ever going to go through. You're leaving this cult. You're saying no effectively, which is not the done thing. You don't know what's going to happen when you say, this is it, I'm leaving. And the reality is, actually, the fear had held you back from doing it, but it was scary as it was. The outcome was so much different to what you'd
Yeah,
expected,
absolutely, absolutely.
Was there to then be hit by yet another, blow? Did you, given the upbringing that you'd had, the God-fearing life that you'd had, did you feel you were being punished?
I didn't at that point. If it had
Good.
happened to me maybe even 6 months earlier, possibly. I remember saying to a friend of mine, only 2 weeks before, if I ever get cancer and that, I know that they'll just say it's my punishment. But I was beyond it at that point. I knew that wasn't the way it worked. People get cancer. um,
But they were of that mindset. Was that
oh,
something that was
absolutely.
said to you?
Yeah.
Oh my
Um,
God.
my dad said he wouldn't use the word punishment, but it was definitely God speaking to me. And when they
Wow.
finally totally cut me off in 2015, that was their reason. That was Dad and Mum's reason, was because I hadn't listened to God. Yeah, yeah,
There'll be so many people who sit and listen to this story thinking the hardest thing ever and the most difficult part is leaving the cult. But actually, it got worse before it got better. The
yeah.
relationships with family members completely broke down. So 2015, you're then cut off by your parents. At this point, were you in remission? Are you
Um,
still undergoing
so,
treatment?
so for after I left in 2013, they sort of at the beginning there was a bit of love bombing went on. They realised that didn't work. Then they just cut me off totally. Then when I got diagnosed with cancer, I think I know they thought, oh, she'll come back.
Yeah.
And so there was that love bombing and care a bit, but they would never come in. Like Mum would never come into my house or anything like that. It was classed as an unclean house. Um, my kids, my youngest kids, before they went to the meetings in the evening, they had to go to my parents' house first to get cleansed before they could go to the meeting.
This complete and utter brainwashing of such young children. That must have been so difficult for them. Spend time with mum in the unclean house, go and see the grandparents to be cleansed, to go and sit in what you now know is a cult, but they had no idea because that's all they've ever known. So where are we at relationship wise by this point? It's 2015, your parents cut you off. What were the relationships like with
No,
your children?
so really, yeah, the three older boys had cut me off before then. Once they knew I wasn't going back, um, and then I still had the youngest two, obviously. 2015, I'd had my reconstruction. Um, they were there. My parents and my sister were there while I had the operation for some weird reason. It was a big op, and I had it done over here because it was under private health. Um, and yeah, then it was after that was that the end of 2015. Apart from my two kids living with me, I had no contact with anybody really. Um, my dad would answer my emails, and he still does sometimes. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he does. Um, my eldest was still answering my emails at that point. Um, yeah, and then 2015, Tasha changed really. Maybe I shouldn't mention her name. Yeah, things changed for her because she decided she'd been a sinner, and yeah, there was distance, and then in St Patrick's Day of 2016, her and her brother went to Brethren Friends for the day. I let them go, and she never came home. Um, Apart from one letter I've had from her, and once when I saw her in a shop when she was running away from me. Um, I've never had any contact with her again. My youngest, the last time I had contact with him was when he got his GCSE results in 2016, and he phoned me, which was surprising. Um, and I took a card and a present for him to my sister's house where he was living. And then he just stopped answering his phone. So I haven't had contact with any of them since I went to New Zealand in 2018.
It's very rare that I am rendered speechless, as you well know, and you've spent many a day in my company. But there is literally nothing that anyone can say to a situation like that. And me sitting here, even attempting, which is, as I say, it's unfathomable, but attempting to put yourself in those shoes, whether that be as a parent or just as a human being, part of someone's life, giving birth to these children, raising them, supporting them, helping them, and for that relationship to completely and utterly break down because you've done something for your own sanity. I'm sure everyone listening has a huge amount of respect for you to be able to not only, continue with the relationship as best you can do with them, always try and maintain contact, but know that for your own sanity, you just had to leave that situation. And this is one of the reasons you speak out now, is that, they've been raised within that way through no fault of their own, just like you were raised within that way through no fault of your own. I just have massive amounts of respect because I can't even fathom it. And this must have been so difficult for you to rebuild your life. You've now gone forward, and I don't want to dwell on the negative part of it because that it can't be easy by any means.
No,
So
it's
what
not.
I am
It's
going
not.
to do,
And even talking about it is,
harrowing.
it is triggering. And I do have coping mechanisms where I just put a lot behind, the back of my mind as much as I can. And and as regards to my children, I look on it as another stage of motherhood where, although I haven't got them physically, I'm doing this not just for me, but I'm doing it for them.
I have goosebumps all over my hands and my face, all over my arms and my face, because this is such a big part of the reason you're raising awareness. Because as you mentioned earlier on, this community, this cult, this sect still exists to this day. It continues to get worse in so much as, I've done so much reading up about it since meeting you, because genuinely the first time that we met, when someone says, this was the life that I was in, there was a little bit of a like, what now, that these things actually exist? Because the hearing of things like a sect and a cult and this kind of environment, it's the stuff of movies, it's the stuff
Mm.
of fables, it's the stuff of books, but the reality is this was your life and still is, in that it plays this big part in your past. I know it's really difficult for you in terms of the breakdown of relationships with your children. They've gone on to have their own children, and obviously, it's really difficult for you in that way. But what I do want to give massive recognition for is the fact that you're raising awareness for this now, because you are one of the very small group of people in the reality of, if you look at the size of the community
Yeah,
versus
yeah,
those who've
yeah.
escaped. And I purposely use the word escape because even the fear that you have to endure for so many years, just thinking of wanting to leave this environment, it is something that you've escaped
It
from.
is.
So,
It is. I always like to use that word myself. It
yeah,
doesn't mean that I physically moved out of my house, but it is escaping, and fear. It is, there's three things that hold people in that situation, and it's fear, family, and finance, um, because they're very rich, and that is what's holding so many people. But it is, yeah, people say, "Oh, move on." You can't move on from something. It's not that I'm not moving on. I am having my life, but I think
yeah,
part of that is exposing this, and if it's, if it's not my children, it could be my grandchildren. It
Your mission is so much bigger than you are.
Yeah,